I'd like to introduce our esteemed guest, MJ Akbar, who's one of India's most distinguished journalists, a former Member of Parliament, and who's just released his new book, Tinderbox, The Past and Future of Pakistan. So please welcome MJ.
Thank you.
Great. I'd also like to preface the session that as a couple of the writers who were supposed to be here, Edgar Carrot from Israel and Eliza Griswold from the United States, unfortunately couldn't make it, so you're just stuck with me, Fareed. That's not a typo, because a lot of people came up and asked me about that. That is my name. And I'm based out at University of Western Sydney, and I'll be talking with MJ. And we'll try and solve it, because I think we've got an hour. We'll try and solve the whole quagmire in an hour, because I know you've got lunch and so on. So I'm very wary of that. When I was approached to chair this panel, and the title itself is evocative, and we've heard that, because the quote that comes to mind, Mark Twain's history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And we see that imagining peace in the Middle East has become almost synonymous. It's become synonymous with a post-September 11 era, but also pre-September 11. And two writers came to mind when I first heard this provocative title. One of them, of course, the Palestinian-American writer and literary theorist Edward Said, and his phrase, which he coined so beautifully, imaginative geographies, right, in his magnum opus Orientalism, which he talks about how the Middle East in itself as a term was imagined in a colonial enterprise. But also for me, part of the younger generation, Tupac Shakur, who was a great hip-hop lyricist, talked about, can a brother get a little peace? There's war in the streets and there's still war in the Middle East. And this song, almost prophetically written 20 years ago, still reverberates until today. When thinking of the Middle East, in terms of the birthplace of religions and the sometimes pernicious cycles of violence that accompany it, inevitably you end up at the main site of Jerusalem. And when I was strolling through MJ's beautiful writings, I came across a recent article of his written in India Today about a month ago. So I'll just ask you, MJ, if you could start off with the first couple of paragraphs to set the scene of what we're talking about today.
Thank you, Fareed. At least your parents gave you a name that you could claim publicly.
Yeah.
My first name has so many syllables, I reduce it to MJ.
Yeah. You're in good company. You're in good company. Michael Jackson, so on. Yeah.
I think Fareed has set the stage for a discussion with an important element, humor. Because if you don't have a sense of humor when you're discussing war, you will be depressed to death. The humor, of course, is not to be confused with being facile. We are not facile, but we do hope that we can still be human about a fairly inhuman business. He mentioned certain concepts, and you're absolutely right. It's not merely imagined geographies out there. There are also imagined pasts. And the claim of the past on the present and the future becomes so visceral that you almost, when you enter a city like Jerusalem, which I've done many times, and I was there, I think, in January, to meet Shimon Peres, the Israeli Foreign Office, and so on and so forth, as part of my normal work. You almost enter a haunted house. And it's not haunted by the imagination. It is haunted by realities that are very, very strongly inbuilt. And the thing is that the worse it gets for people, the more the imagined past becomes a comfort zone. And you cling on to it as your only hope to make sense out of something as insensible as war. I mentioned war so often because you can't discuss peace without knowing the meaning of war.
Yeah.
It's not quite its opposite, but it sits aside it, astride it. And we really need to address, and I hope that during the course of our discussions, we'll carry forward the meaning, not
Yes.
only of the war as it is being fought now, but war as it might be 10 years later,
Yeah.
which is probably far more dangerous. Not probably, certainly far more
Yeah.
dangerous. The term Middle East itself was invented, and I say this as an introduction, in 1903 by a naval historian in the US Navy. And when he defined it, he did include India as part of the Middle East. And certainly one part of India, the western part of India, Pakistan, now is fairly almost now contiguous to the wars of the Middle East. Just before Iraq, NATO made a concerted effort, and I happened to be invited to the conference they held in Brussels to discuss an extended Middle East, where broadly they were trying to now imagine a Middle East in which the original idea of 1903 could be co-opted again. That means the whole of India. But that was inviting the non-Pakistan part of India into a very, very dangerous quagmire, and I didn't see ourselves stepping in so happily. But thank you, Fareed, for mentioning this piece, and he wants me to be something that writers are not, which is modest, and read only 3 paragraphs. But I shall read only 3 paragraphs. The title is City of Wailing Walls. This is Jerusalem. The most complex word to explain is surely normalcy. The standards of 7,000 years flutter over the beautifully lit battlements of Jerusalem. The sun sinks, the temperature plummets, the decibels fade. It has become a city of silence. The living trip warily around the dead, who are exalted in prophets' tombs or masked in graveyards, or echo within memory and prejudice in competitive, combative narratives. Jerusalem is a theatre of the final judgment for Jews, who will either descend to Jahannam, the Arabic word in the Quran is Jahannam, down the hill or pass through God's gate of mercy above. Christians lament the betrayal of their Savior, Jesus, not merely by Judas, whose guilt drove him to suicide, but also by Peter, who choked whatever anguish he may have felt. They mourn the crucifixion and celebrate resurrection. Muslims glory in the ascension of Prophet Muhammad to heaven from the rock on the mount at the spot where Solomon built his great temple. If faith was not enough, Jewish, Crusader and Arab empires have left their mark on stone. Dinner conversation creeps through the intricacies of claim and survival, possession and legitimacy, construction and decay, before it gets lost in the labyrinths of ultra-orthodoxy, Salafist exclusion, aggression, response, and the diminishing core of secular liberalism.
Thank you. So tell us what possessed you to write these words, which captured, you know, the tripatriate nature of these religions, and your experience in Jerusalem, especially now in the midst of a so-called Arab Spring.
What defines you about Jerusalem today is the same thing that defined Jerusalem for thousands of years: walls. The Great Wall around the fortress of Jerusalem has first challenged the Crusaders, first challenged the Arabs.
Yeah.
In 635, 36. Then challenged the Crusaders. Then challenged Saladin. And now challenges the heirs of Saladin. Human beings are extremely, extremely good at finding the money to build walls. Very rarely do they find the capacity within themselves, as they did in Berlin, to break walls. Walls are not just cement, Actually, cement walls, now Israel has created another wall around Ramallah, around this, around that, around that. The walls are not really built in cement because that is a fragile wall. The more difficult wall to break down is the walls that build in the mind, where you inevitably refuse to see somebody as close to your neighbor, and if you see him, then it is only for purposes of fear and hatred. When that spirit descends on any space, then you begin to find the perfect recipe for violence, war, and the inability to do something that should be at the very heart of civilization, which is communicate. If there is no communication, there is no civilization. So that sense that, and the other thing is that you get this huge impression, if walls you build around for security, what do they end, do they become? I mean, I create this wall around this beautiful hill in order to protect myself. And what does it become? It becomes a prison. Because the wall prevents you from going out, just as much it prevents the outsider from coming in. And who can enjoy life in a prison? And that's the real problem of Jerusalem, and by extension the whole of the Middle East. Everybody is in a prison. And nobody knows who lost the key. Nobody knows that. There are no wardens. Those who have tried to be wardens of the Middle East, including America, have returned with a bloody nose, or worse, or a slit throat. And the one thing that is very interesting is that when it comes to giving the warden of the bloody nose, then both sides of the prison cooperate.
Well, that's always the case in such a complicated region, but aren't you seeing the cracks in the wall beginning to appear? One of the expressions that started to permeate through media coverage of Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, so on, is that fear barrier was broken once and for all, and now we're living with the repercussions of the rubble. What was your sense of the rapid transformations technologically and sociologically in Sidi Bouzid that extended and lit throughout the Middle East in terms of just a fire of democracy, so to speak?
The many walls of the Middle East extend to different parameters and very exotic parameters. Among the walls that have been built are the walls built by dictators in Arab nations. And they trap their own people, very often using Israel as the alibi. Not that there is not a genuine Palestinian cause, of course there is. And when you talk of imagined past, I'm reminded of a man who actually has the temerity to think that he could become President of the United States, Newt Gingrich. And he says that the Palestinians are an imagined people. I mean, you should send him on a refresher course in common sense.
Yeah. Or just read Mark Twain, something like
something.
That,
But look at how fictions are created in order to, defend the indefensible. But the real story out there that is emerging is a fascinating story. It's a story of the peoples and young peoples.
Yes.
It's not a story of all the people. It is a story of young people yearning for something that they have not seen, which is freedom. Every nation which is independent, it does not mean that that nation is free. After World War I, when many of these nations were created over a glass of, I suppose, less than salubrious gin in some London bar, literally, over, rulers that knew only straight lines. I mean, all these nations have straight line boundaries, as if that was, as if it wasn't the most unnatural thing in the world. And so on. When these nations were created and handed over to an archaic idea called feudalism, called monarchy, that was when the second trap of the Middle East was set. That this trap would not only include a nation for the Jewish people who had now suffered so much under German oppression. I mean, I can't understand, as I said, that if Jerusalem is depressing, then I think the two, one of the most, I mean, a place which literally made me, as a writer, as a human being, shudder. And when I say shudder, I mean it. I couldn't take it. Was Auschwitz. And you know, I could understand that the West would feel extremely guilty, because the death of Jews was not merely a German enterprise. The death of Jews included the fact that the British couldn't care about them, couldn't care about those populations. That anti-Semitism was a established reality of Europe. While there was anti-Semitism, some amount of it, even in the Muslim world, remember one thing, that when the British armies and the Australian armies entered Jerusalem in 1917, they were shocked to find that 70% of the Chamber of Commerce was Jewish. They were shocked to find thriving Jewish communities in the whole of the Ottoman world. Those of you who take a trip to Istanbul for a holiday, and I urge you to do that, would find a synagogue right on the Bosphorus as one of the principal presences. So Muslims and Jews have lived together easily, actually, if not equally, because equality was not a known definition of societies in the pre-democratic age. These relationships were disturbed by the arrival of what would be called the post-colonial age. Now, the post-colonial age is defined by two realities. One is the Indian reality, where we found, after we got freedom, after we got independence, we also found freedom, because we were a democracy. But in the large parts of the post-colonial world, colonization was replaced by neo-colonization. What is neo-colonization? Neo-colonization is a grant of independence as long as you don't exercise it.
Like the banks.
Yeah. That is precisely what the dictators and despots of the Middle East were doing. Not all of them were children of the West. I mean, were children of America and Britain. Quite a few of them became children of the Soviet Union. But whatever else, the genetic code said that your dad has to be a foreigner. And that was the basis of the neo-colonization that swept and led to the heartening fact of the Arab Spring is that it's controlled by young people who have no vested interest anymore in the past, but a tremendous vested interest in the future. And that vested interest is a future in which they can, unlike their fathers, unlike their grandfathers, finally create their own destinies. When that happens, perhaps that is the only glimmer of hope I can see in that region. The sooner our generation gets the hell out of the way, the better it is for that region.
Well, extending that biological metaphor, you talk in your book about Pakistan having a religious DNA. And what we've seen in the Middle East is the proliferation of Islamist, Christian, and other political groups that have created a new meaning out of religion, entering into the political sphere once the patriarchal vacuum of Mubarak and Gaddafi had left. Do you think this also applies to other nations, even such as Australia, in terms of this religious DNA? And can it mutate, for example? Can it, become abnormal? You talk about the sense of normalcy in here.
Religion was part of the cultural, what would be called socio-cultural political inheritance of all societies, whether Australia, India, and so on and so forth. But it was never the single source for political mobilization. This argument we had in India all the time during the creation of Pakistan. And the people who, Indian Muslims, and this is argument between Muslims, who argued against the idea of Pakistan, pointed out that never in the history of Muslims was there any evidence that religion had been sufficient as a glue for nationalism. After all, let's take one contemporary fact to explain this. If religion had been sufficient, why would there be 22 Arab countries? They have Islam in common, they have language in common, they have culture in common. But political mobilization does not. Islam is a brotherhood. It is not a nationhood. Christianity is a brotherhood. It's of people of the faith. It is not a nationhood. Australia is not going to surrender its independence to Britain just because both happen to be Christians. So, this element of dragging in. Now, the reason why we saw this desecration, despicable desecration of graves in Libya, despicable, completely anti-faith, anyone's faith, including the faith of Islam, was because of a curious twist in the history. I was traveling maybe 7 years ago, and driving from Cairo up to Alexandria. It was Friday, and I think perhaps out of courtesy to the driver, perhaps out of a sense of a journalist's inbuilt suicidal tendency towards curiosity, you know, I just stopped. The namaz time had come, so I stopped him and said that, you know, it was a wayside mosque. I said, would you like to go and pray? He said, yes, I would love to, you know, go and do my Friday prayers. I said, look, I'll come along with you. So I went on. And he was also my translator in the khutbah. Khutbah is the sermon delivered by the Imam in Friday prayers. And you came to a very interesting realization that using code words, the only place which was a source of dissent against the barbarism of people and powerful people who used mukhabarat, who used the intelligence and torture in order to sustain family power, who had turned countries into private family real estates. I mean, when I was writing Shade of Swords, which was the previous book, one of the points that made me deeply unpopular, and I enjoy being unpopular for these reasons, was when I said that the historic mistake was made in 1931, when a nation called Arabia was permitted by the whole world to rename itself Saudi Arabia. Saudi is the name of a family. It's a royal dynasty. Why is Arabia important to me? I've not been on Hajj, but I've been on Umrah. I've been to Mecca three times. It's part of my faith. And there is something that touches me deeply when I go there. But why is it that Arabia is important to me? Because it is the land of my prophet. Just as Jerusalem is important to you because it is the land of your last prophet. Jesus is also my prophet. In the Quran, calls Jesus he calls Jesus the soul of Allah, Ruh Allah. Ruh Allah is the Quranic term for Jesus. So it's important to me. I said, but Muhammad, when he died, did not leave in his will that Arabia should be renamed Muhammadiyya Arabia. Who is this royal family which has renamed a whole country after itself? And therefore, actually physically converted nations into private real estate. And that is how they function. So there has to be a challenge that the mosque was the one source which the intelligence services feared to enter, because they knew that was the last barrier. The middle classes, including the great liberal English-speaking middle classes in Syria, in Cairo, had been co-opted by these regimes very intelligently. Because they knew that, you know, feeding these middle classes with a few tidbits would ensure their support. They would control media. They would be the face of argument when questions were raised by people from the West or people from Australia. And this actually continued until the same middle classes led the challenge. One of the thoughts I had left behind in The Shade of Swords, published by Routledge in 2002, was that within 10 years, the whole of the Arab world would face its French Revolution. And this time around, there would not be tumbrils, hopefully. But yet, there would be a revolution. And you can see, it was very visible when I was traveling in that region, that these revolutions were coming. I may have mentioned this yesterday. I'm glad to repeat this. When we watch history unfold, particularly in such dramatic terms, please do not confuse history or its pace with our lifetimes. When history is written, we might be very lucky to get 3 or 4 pages. Its pace is slow. So the consequences of the Arab Spring will be finally evident 10 years later, 15 years later. I'm always reminded of the great story between Henry Kissinger and Chou En-lai during the discussions, when the first opening discussions. And when Henry Kissinger asked Chou En-lai that what are the consequences of the French Revolution, and Chou En-lai replied, I think it's a bit too early to tell.
Well, speaking of the consequences of the Arab Revolution, it seems like when it comes to Egypt or Libya, there was a readiness on the West's part to embrace such movements for change, even though they were part of the rotting, corrupt, despotic regimes. But when it comes to Syria, Arab intellectuals and Arab intelligentsia seem to shy away from the reality of massacres and bloodshed in Homs and other cities that are badly pronounced in the Western media. So, why is that? Why is there so much dissent? So everyone with Egypt, yes, we got to get rid of Mubarak, we got to get rid of Gaddafi. When it comes to Assad, the reins are held in quite a bit. Why is that happening so readily, especially by Arab intellectuals?
With Syria, I think that old wariness, willing to strike but afraid to wound, or willing to wound but afraid to strike, is kicking in. I think the appetite for intervention is becoming little more nuanced. But Syria is not, the fate of Syria is not going to be determined by the Western alliance. The fate of Syria is going to be determined, one, by Syrians, and number two, by Turks. And the Turks have a vested interest in that area because they are close to it. They are the neighborhood. And I think a little hopefully maybe, when I discussed this with my Turkish friends, I said, you know, we can't reconstruct empires because, I mean, the Arab doesn't want to replace a pseudo-Western empire with a Turkish one. But
we've had that before.
Sorry?
We've had that before.
I know.
Yeah.
You've had that before, and occasionally to your regret.
Yeah.
But I think the space and influence of Turkey as a successful model for what a nation can become, that is the key to Turkey's influence. Not Turkey's arms, not Turkey's weapons, but the fact that a Muslim majority state within the Middle East can have a city like Istanbul, can have freedoms of religion, can have freedom of commerce, can have an economy which is growing at 8%, 10%, something of that sort, and can do it without, one, imposing dictatorship. There are elections every 4 years, all free and fair. No, by withdrawing from its natural cultural inheritance, that you don't have to abandon Islam in order to be modern. That too people will not accept. You don't have to abandon Christianity in order to be modern. You don't have to abandon Buddhism or Hinduism or any faith. Those who want to abandon religion altogether are most welcome. After all, the definition of secular society is not only the right to practice your religion, but the right to practice atheism. Do what you wish, as long as you are not an imposition on your neighbor, as long as you are not a public nuisance. That's the only qualification civilized societies have.
But with Turkey,
gender equality in Turkey, critical. That is the future. You cannot be a modern nation without gender equality. That is one of the great problems of Muslim societies. Here I'm talking to a society which has crossed these problems and barriers over your own struggles. It isn't that it happened overnight. As Jermaine Greer, the most well-known Australian I know, wrote a few days ago in, I think it was in The Age. I say that I was speaking to in Deoband, which is the seminary which is considered the most conservative, and there were about young people, maybe 5,000-6,000 people who were really training to be Maulvis. So from the seminary, it's a madrasa, the most famous madrasa in South Asia. And I said, if you do not treat your sister, your daughter, on the same plane, on the same level as you treat the boys and sons, And if Muslim society does not understand the importance of this social revolution, I said, no one will let you enter the 19th century. Who's giving you permission to enter the 21st? These are the critical challenges. They don't get headlines. You never see a headline, gender change has happened or hasn't happened. But these are the critical issues that will determine where precisely the Arab Spring will go. If the Arab Spring has to travel forward rather than be regressive, and these realities will make the fringe, I mean the present fringe, when I was talking about the mosque, the first fruits of revolution will always go to the institution that has been consistent in its opposition to the regime, which was the mosque, the brotherhood. But that is the present. This present will disappear in maybe that is my hope, maybe that is my imagined future, very, very quickly. It can't sustain itself with all the images that we have seen in Tahrir Square.
Hey. Great, yeah. I think you're correct to point out that it will take a long time, and when we talk about the semantic meanings of a revolution, it's still in mid-revolution. But 1 year on, looking at these gender relations, for example, the most poignant case for me was in Egypt when a woman was beaten and stripped by the military, and
Yep.
Islamist scholars and other pundits who have come out just as in the same, strident rhetoric, such as Newt Gingrich, for example, admonished her for going out and being part of the revolution. But what it pointed out to me was the civil and military relations in such regimes post a dictator. And you use a beautiful term in your book where you talk about, I think it was Ayub Khan, or about a civil dictator. How do you see that manifesting itself? Because you could argue the same for Turkey in terms of its shocking history with not acknowledging the Armenian genocide and Assyrian and Greeks, for example. But also in other terms, the parallels between, for me, Turkey, Pakistan and Egypt are quite profound. What are your thoughts on the civil and military relations at the current impasse?
Pakistan began in its view of itself. Yesterday I was talking about that fascinating character called Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan. And it did occur to me yesterday, I said that anyone who was in love with Shakespeare, actually Jinnah, after he ate his dinners at the bar at Lincoln's Inn in England and became one of the prized positions in society, was a barrister from England in colonial society in 1906, 1907, earlier than that, 1901 too. After he ate his dinners, he actually wanted to join Old Vic and play Romeo. He was absolutely fascinated by Shakespeare, but it's a wonderful thing. I say that in greatest admiration, largely because I would never have the guts to do that. He was a conflicted character, but his real hero in the 1920s and 30s was Kemal Ataturk. And he read a book which his daughter, and he gave it to his daughter when he was in self-exile in 1931-33, called The Wolf, which was an early biography of Kemal Ataturk. And he gave it to his daughter, and the daughter actually nicknamed her father, yes, I'll call you Wolf from now on. And Jinnah saw what Kemal Ataturk was doing, was picking up a country, a nation with a powerful history, a powerful literature, a great sense of understanding. All empires of those days, the management empires was left to those who were taught literature. The British Empire's ICS servants, I mean, talking Indian civil service, I'm sure there was an equivalent here. When they were sent to Haileybury to study, what were they taught? They were not taught the history of India, they were taught Greek and Latin. And why? This is the classic great thing about literature, that if you can understand Macbeth, you will understand power in any society. You will understand power in Canberra as much you will do in Delhi.
I'm going to
or
refrain
Cairo.
from commenting on Canberra because I'm from Sydney, but yeah, Sussex Street. Yeah.
So, and this was the key. And the Turks had a fascinating. Their bureaucrats were taught three things. Marvelous, absolutely. He says, no, you want to rule an empire, you need to study three languages. Arabic, to understand your faith. Persian, to understand poetry and love poetry. Because if you don't understand poetry, you will never understand human beings. And Turkish, to understand power. So within this time, this was a nation which has ruled the world for 1,000, or its known world for 1,000 years. But when Turkey had to emerge from it, Kemal Atatürk took the past, almost picked it up by the hair on its head, a Medusa hair full of snakes, picked it up, squeezed the snakes out, and had no compunction. He was a military dictator as ever there was one. But forced change with a brutal fist, but created the conditions also for the future. And why do I say he created? Because he produced modern education. One of our great figures of Indian Muslim history was Maulana Muhammad Ali. Two brothers, Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali, who were born children of Indian bureaucrats, went to Cambridge and Oxford, so that generation, and later on discovered faith and therefore were called Maulana. But in 1911, one of them wrote an article in the Times of India in good Oxbridge English, saying that I can't understand what the British are complaining about. If they didn't want us to revolt, why did they educate us?
But
that is the...
Are these the necessary conditions for change at the moment? Because we have the arguments about Arabs, for example, being antithetical. It's not in their political DNA to accept democracy. But the imposed educational systems of the past 100, 200 years or so, based on Turkish and French models of education that I was schooled in myself, actually led to the current impasse that we're seeing at the moment. I can't see dictatorial change being, squeezing the venom out of the rotting corruption for the past 30 years in Egypt or Libya, for example, be the way to proceed. Doesn't it have to be modeled by the youth who underwent all of this?
You see, there's a difference between the youth. You're young, I think.
No. No.
The difference between the youth and me is that I'd be hitting 60, is that now when I look at the future, I see some hopefully distant form of a grave. When the youth look at it, they see a future. So they have a vested interest in the future. We've reached a point where we have hopefully enough experience, one, to know the value of what we have learned through life and therefore help shape a better world. But also to understand that there comes a time when you have to leave space for the next generation to come and occupy it and take it. And that is the surge. The surge of change is very rarely held in the hands of, the aged. And of course, the meaning of youth is changing thanks to a variety of medicines all advertised.
Well, speaking
we'll
of
try and
youth,
extend it as much as we can, but
yeah,
it is absolutely the young who are going to change the future because they have a vested interest in the ideas called democracy. Today, the information age, television is telling them that they are missing something vital, which was not known to their fathers and grandfathers. Democracy is a very modern phenomenon in historical terms, and much of Europe, had fascism even 60 years ago. So these are very new ideas, and we are fortunate that we've spent, at least I as an Indian am fortunate, that I've had 60 years of it. But contemporary world will look at what we were blessed to receive.
Speaking of technology, you can tweet #ADLWW. But in terms of the technological revolution that we have seen unfolded and the immediacy of it, this is the new phenomenon that we're witnessing of history unfolding before our eyes. It's almost like the Berlin Wall crumbling down, but yeah, and fast forward, what do you see as the role of this technological play, since we've been brandishing this revolution as a Twitter revolution or a Facebook revolution? The revolution will be tweeted, a play on Gil Scott-Aaron's words, for example. What do you see as the role of technology in moving?
You know, technology is an instrument of pace. It's not an instrument of change. It may help communication, and it does help communication. Twitter is available everywhere, including those societies which are stable under dictatorships. But change comes through the definition of a horizon. Yes, it definitely is helped by an exchange of communications. After all, I did say just now that we now are able to see what democracy has brought to large parts of the world, without creating chaos, without creating confusion. The people in 1940s who looked forward into the future, somebody as eminent as Winston Churchill, did not imagine that India deserved democracy. He says these natives, they'll end up in total chaos. It was easier for him to see a nation built around theocracy. Pakistan, he thought theocracy was a legitimate idea which would ensure stability. Nonsense. It is democracy which is the modern idea, which is going to assure people, because this is the first time, maybe in the Athenian age among the Greeks, there was some form of it, but this is the first age of equality. It is not the age of economic equality, because that probably will never happen. But it is certainly the age of, the equality of rights, the equality of participation, the equality of voice. Man does not live by bread alone, and certainly women don't. And these are the forms, these are the driving forces of this age. And when they drive it forward, Hosni Mubarak or Assads and so on eventually become very minor obstacles when history is written, that they will be seen as aberrations. What really saddens me is that the Arab world could have found this under Jamal Nasser. Because, irrespective of the West thought of him, they were great liberals. And yet, they were unable to understand the difference between an individual and a nation. They developed egotisms by which the individuals confused themselves with nations. They became indispensable to countries in their own minds. And when you sort of survive or sustain dictatorships in the name of nationalism, then the overlap not only confuses the ruling classes, but confuses the ruled classes as well for a while. So it is through these cracks and sinews in thinking that new formations will emerge. I don't know. You would certainly be far better equipped to know what will emerge in 5 years, 10 years. But I certainly do know that what will emerge is the basis of a region which will be able to find each other in more compatible terms than it has found each other in the last 60 years, both internally as well as with Israel.
Touching on the last point which you raised, and we might end with this before we go for questions, about the individual and the nation being intimately tied. And we've heard the expressions which Jermaine Greer has gone forth and promulgated, the personal is the political. What I'm interested in is the familial and how it parallels the national. And a couple of weeks ago, a respected journalist of the New York Times, Anthony Shadid, passed away in Syria. And his soon-to-be published memoir, House of Stone, tracks the genealogical and paternal patterns, and Edward Said's term of affiliation and filiative, of seeing the family of modern nations. What are your thoughts on do you see any parallels between a family, and we've seen it in a family naming a country after its own name, with House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, the family that we're seeing emerge at the moment in the Middle East?
Well, if the family and the individual are the basis of a social organism, then I think it's a good thing. Because I think nations which have developed children into uniform microcosms, shifting away from family, have actually hurt society far more. And this is not the plea from just a generation but the family is very critical, but that's my personal view. The problem we are discussing is quite different. The problem we are discussing how a family becomes in charge, takes over and turns a nation into its heirlooms. I mean, after 40 years of Hosni Mubarak, I want 40 years more of Jamal Mubarak? No, enough already. Assad, okay, Bashar Assad, 67. And very interestingly, I always used to say that this was one of the problems of the British ruling class. It was whenever a general lost a war, the first thing they did was promote him. Right? Because, I mean, that was the best way to buy him out, otherwise you would blame everyone else in the ruling system. In the Arab world, whenever they lost a war, particularly in 1967, they promoted themselves into ownership of the whole country. Instead of being sensible and resigning and acknowledging responsibility for having destroyed the aspirations and led their countries to disaster. But the worse it seems to get for these chaps, the more possessive they become. The more possessive they become. It's a very simple thing actually. If you, all you have to do if you go to any capital and you want a measure of how much freedom is there, check out how many ex-prime ministers are floating around. Now you go to Delhi, there are lots of them floating around. But in, say, a country like Pakistan, you will never find an ex-president or prime minister. Because he just feels insecure. He doesn't know if he's floating around, will take him to prison. And that is it. When you become dictatorships, then you confuse, you know that the alternative is disaster. And therefore you create small cliques. It has been known before. And I do want to end on another note,
yes,
which is, we've spent some time discussing war. Let me offer a slightly depressing thought about peace.
Correct.
I promise you to depress you. After the Second World War, we have seen, on historical terms, the longest spell of peace, at least in Europe. Never has Europe been as peaceful as it has been. This peace has been assured by a theory whose consequences could be devastating. Mutually assured destruction. The other consequence of, or the other consequence is that there is another way to get peace, which is the Pax Romana kind of peace, the peace established by the superpower of the time. Pax Romana, Pax Britannica, maybe Pax Americana. Neither idea, either of mutually assured destruction or of a Pax Superparana, is going to work. And that is the danger at the heart of the arrangements we have created for ourselves.
Reminds me of JFK's quote, peace of the grave,
Yeah,
not the security of the slave,
not the security.
but genuine peace. And that is something what we're striving for. But for me, the overriding ambition that I've seen amongst my compatriots, for example, speaking to them in Egypt a few weeks ago, one of my close friends that got actually shot in the eye. A prominent hip-hop artist who graced the stage of Tahrir Square, and he said, I'm going to go down again tomorrow. And if I lose the other eye, then that's the price I have to pay for justice. And I think that's the term it's worth clinging upon at the moment. Of justice, and with it comes these vaunted values of integrity, freedom, and ultimately peace. Because peace has this stale quality to it. And I'd rather a more dynamic sense of coexistence.
Right.
Okay, we might end with that and we take a few questions. Can I urge you to just keep them pointed and direct them to whoever you want to answer? And if you have a comment, we'll just take it as that. But please keep them pointed because we have 10 minutes to go. The mic is just over there near that tree.
I find it hard to imagine peace in the Middle East when I read the reports in our newspapers discussing the likelihood of an attack by Israel and perhaps the United States on Iran. And I would like to ask, do you think the probability is that such an attack will happen? And if it does, is there a justification for it? And if that attack happened, what would be the ramifications for the Middle East and the rest of the world? Thanks.
Okay. MJ?
Thank you. In fact, when I ended on the note of mutually assured destruction as a basis, I was referring to precisely this. That the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons is tempting its antagonists to buy insurance by getting their own. North Korea is an insignificant country, but nobody invades North Korea because the potential collateral damage of it is so significant. So this is really the danger in the peace formations that we have created. How do you correlate this? Why should Iran not have a bomb, Israel have one, India and Pakistan have one, and so on and so forth? Is the behavior of governments simply the only rationale? And therefore, if Iran had the Shah of Iran, let us say, still in power, would then the Iranian nuclear bomb have been acceptable? These are very difficult questions. And you've raised, in fact, the most critical one. Today, one of the things that I was discussing in Jerusalem, as I said, look, what Iran, I don't know if it has the bomb or not, it probably doesn't actually, and it's still a long way from it. But what it has managed, it has created the zone of uncertainty. So if you bomb 3,000-pound bombs, go and devastate those bunkers, we don't know what human devastation will actually be a consequence of in Iran itself. How much radioactivity will go? What will the price? Well, for those who are more cold-blooded, what will be the consequent price of oil? So how it will devastate economies? So these are questions which are believing, but I think those who are urging caution, as Barack Obama is, are definitely, and I'm really, really pleased that even in the face of a difficult election, he's mature enough to understand that war is a hysterical option.
Completely.
May I ask you this question? To what factors, principally, do you ascribe the apparent failure of democracy in Pakistan?
That was really one of the themes yesterday. But the failure of democracy, let me just recap one aspect of it in my hope to be both lucid and brief, very difficult. But the problem between India and Pakistan is not a problem it's not a relationship of nation to nation state. It is a relationship between ideology and ideology. In a sense that India represents the problems and the possibilities, definitely the problems. And you don't have to ask anyone else about the problems of India, because I get paid a fairly decent amount to tell you about them. Is a relationship between a liberal democracy and a growing theocracy. The idea of Pakistan is built around the belief that one community, because it is Muslim, cannot coexist with people it has lived together for 1,000 years. It is a mad idea. It is perhaps something worse. It is a suicidal idea. For very long, I've said that 1947 is the longest suicide note written in history. But there it is. You can't change it. Pakistan's inability to come to grips with democracy lies in the fact that it has committed itself to theocracy. Therefore, Pakistan doesn't need another general election, it needs another constituent assembly. What is the difference between Indians and Pakistanis? Let me tell you the shocking news, there is none. We are the same people. Why therefore has one nation moved on one arc and why another nation has moved in another. 60 years ago, Pakistan was created in order to give security to Indian Muslims. At that moment, it had 20% minorities or non-Muslims. Today it has only 2% non-Muslims, and those 2% desperate to get out.
Yes.
It is in fact an ethnic cleansing. But even here, now that there are no non-Muslims left, Pakistan is the one country where more Muslims die every day than in the rest of the Muslim world, including perhaps Syria put together. Why has that happened? Why have the same people moved? Because the power of an idea, in fact, is stronger than the power of the human being. India succeeds because the idea of India is stronger than the Indian. Pakistan is where it is because the idea of Pakistan is weaker than the Pakistan.
Okay. We have our last questioner.
Could you please talk to us about Afghanistan and how do you see the future? We have been there for nearly over 10 years, and I can't see where it's going to end or how it's going to end.
Afghanistan has now become co-terminus space with Pakistan in political terms. For a long while, we thought that the probability was that if, let us say, the Taliban return, because I cannot see NATO having the appetite to stay there for much longer. Unfortunately, I come from a country which is not called Australia. I have to live in the neighborhood. It is the world's deadliest neighborhood now. We are in the middle of the Fourth World War. First World War, in 2 years you'll be commemorating its beginning. First World War moved into the second moved into the third, and the Third World War, which is the Cold War, segued into the fourth, which is the war on terrorism. Everything is interconnected. And for the central battlefield of the first three wars was Europe, but the central battlefield of the Fourth World War is South Asia. And this war, what happens to wars? Wars have no respect for geography. You've all lived through the Vietnam War, well, most of you have lived through the Vietnam War. You've seen how a war that started for the fight for around Saigon, engulfed Laos, Cambodia, Kampuchea, everything around there. Wars have no respect for geography. A war which has begun, there are fires, distant places. If there is war against Iran, trust me, there will be, you can have one day's headlines about the consequences of bombs. But the war will then stretch from the border of India, Lahore, right across to the Nile. Contiguous. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt. This will become the most dangerous arc. Let me throw another frightening thought in front of you. As parallel realities. We are seeing the emergence in 10 years' time of the nuclear crescent. What is the nuclear crescent? Contiguous nation, Israel, Iraq, Pakistan, Israel, Iran, Pakistan, India, China, North Korea, Russia, all will be nuclear powers. Military nuclear powers. Right? Each with its stockpile. 70 to 80% of the world's energy is within this space. How long before somebody thinks a matchstick is a good idea? So we are looking at the completely a zone which is fragile, a zone that is inflammable, a zone that is explosive, and the zone whose consequences, if you don't understand what is going on in Afghanistan, Afghanistan understands what is going on in Australia. So that battlefield, the war has to be fought. We will be doing it, I know that. We will be doing it. It has to be fought. It has to be fought just on one note. It has to be fought intelligently. It can't be fought by drones alone.
And I think it'll be fought by the pen much more so than the sword at this point. And when you're talking about zones, maybe to leave it on a less depressing note if I can. is that this region also, and within all of these zones, Mary Lewis Pratt talks about contact zones. And we see poetry and hip-hop and art and literature transform itself into a vulnerable beauty that we've never seen before, only in these heady days. So I really do hope so, that amongst all the pillaging and the rubble and the walls that we've erected by ourselves, that we can slowly bring them down without even touching a single brick. Thank you so much for listening and your engagement today. Book signing is over there. I highly recommend it. It's called Tinder Box, The Future and Past of Pakistan. And we'll see you all next year.